Throw this one away, Lydia said, sliding the application across Maren Vale's desk. No degree, no corporate experience, and he wants the night janitor shift. Maren barely glanced at it until she saw the name Jonas Reed. Her pen froze above the paper. 36. School maintenance electrical repair warehouse inventory overnight delivery. A resume. Everyone else in the building would dismiss in 5 seconds. But Maren's face went pale because 8 years ago at 4 a.m. in a flooded hallway, a soaked stranger had handed her back the one thing that kept her from losing everything. Since then, she had built a company, survived 14 funding rounds, and smiled from 3 national business magazine covers. Yet, she had never found the man who saved her future. Now he was asking her for a mop. Maren didn't explain. She only closed the folder and told Lydia, "Clear my afternoon." By tomorrow morning, one arrogant hiring manager would learn why mocking Jonas Reed was the most expensive mistake of his life. Where are you watching from? Subscribe if you believe quiet kindness always returns. Because when Maren finally stood to meet Jonas, she had no idea what he was still hiding. If you're new here, stories like this one are what we do. Hit subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. Lydia had learned not to ask questions when Maren used that particular tone. It wasn't sharp or impatient. It was quieter than that. The kind of quiet that meant something had shifted behind her employer's eyes. And the best thing to do was simply move. The afternoon cleared in 12 minutes. Maren spent the next 20 reading Jonas Reed's application 3 times. Not because it was complicated, because she kept getting stuck on the same line near the bottom of the second page written in the notes section where most applicants listed references or availability. Jonas had written, "I'm available for any shift that allows me to take my daughter to school in the morning." Not, "I'm highly motivated." Not, "I'm a team player." Just that one sentence that told her everything about what he needed and nothing about what he wanted in return. She remembered the night in fragments, the way memories do when they've been stored for a long time in a place you don't visit often. She had been 26, working out of a rented room she shared with 2 other engineers, surviving on instant noodles, and the specific kind of desperate optimism that only exists when you have nothing to lose, because you never had much to begin with. The notebook had everything, not just the battery core schematics. Those could theoretically be reconstructed given enough time. She didn't have. But the handwritten calculations she'd been refining for 7 months, margin notes, failed iterations crossed out and reworked. The kind of thinking that can't be replicated because it happened in a particular order on particular nights when her mind was moving in a particular direction. Losing it wouldn't just have cost her the pitch. It would have cost her the proof that she could do this at all. She hadn't even realized she'd left it on the bus until she was already back at her building, key in hand, and the weight of her bag felt wrong. What happened next was something she had never spoken about publicly. Not in interviews, not in the memoir she'd been asked to write twice and declined both times. A man she had never met showed up at her door at 3:58 in the morning, her bag in his hands, and told her he'd found the address written on the inside cover. He'd taken 2 buses to get to the right neighborhood, then walked the last part because the route didn't run that late. When she tried to give him money, everything she had in her wallet, which wasn't much, he shook his head and said the bag looked important and he didn't want her to lose it. Then he left. She had made it to the pitch on 4 hours of sleep and shaking hands. The investors said yes. Maren had thought about him over the years. The way you think about something you can't quite hold on to present enough to feel too incomplete to do anything with. She didn't know his name. She hadn't thought to ask, and he hadn't offered it. All she had was a face she'd seen once in bad light and a specific quality of steadiness that some people carry without seeming to know it. Now she had a name and a 2-page application for an evening janitorial position. She asked Lydia to bring him in directly rather than routing him through HR. Lydia noted this on her tablet without comment. Jonas Reed arrived at 2:15, wearing a blue button-down shirt that had been ironed carefully and had still lost the battle with the heat outside. His shoes were clean. The left one had a small separation beginning at the toe that he'd glued back down, and the glue line was barely visible unless you were looking for it. Mara noticed because she had once owned a pair of shoes in exactly that condition and worn them to a client meeting and told herself no one would notice. He looked around the office once when he came in, not with awe, just with the practical attention of someone who had spent time in a lot of buildings and automatically noted ceiling height, vent placement, the location of the electrical panel behind the reception desk. Then he looked at Marin and said he thought there might have been a scheduling mistake because he'd applied for the facilities team, not an executive position. His voice was even, not nervous, not performing, calm, just even. Marin told him to sit down and that there was no mistake. She watched him process this. He sat, rested his hands on his knees, and waited. He didn't fill the silence with small talk, which told her something. People who had spent a lot of time in rooms where they were evaluated learned either to over-explain or to go still. Jonas went still. She told him she wanted to ask him about something that happened 8 years ago. And she described it the way she remembered it. The bus, the notebook, the knock on her door before 4 in the morning. She didn't dress it up. She said it plainly, the same way she'd have described a business transaction, because she sensed that was the version he'd be most comfortable receiving. She watched his face as he listened. There was a delay a few seconds where he was clearly pulling at something distant and then a shift, subtle but real. He leaned back slightly. His jaw tightened, not with tension, but with the specific expression of someone who has just realized the room they walked into is different from the room they thought they were entering. "That was you," he said. It wasn't a question. Marin said yes. He looked at her for a moment, then looked at the window. "I didn't know you'd built all this." She told him she knew he didn't. She told him she'd been trying to figure out for years how to find him, and then his application came across her desk, and she'd had to clear her afternoon. Jonas nodded slowly. He didn't seem overwhelmed by it. He seemed to be doing what she suspected he usually did with unexpected information, turning it over, checking its weight, deciding what it actually meant. He said he appreciated that she remembered, but that it had been a long time and he'd just done what seemed obvious. Marin told him she understood he saw it that way. She also told him she'd read his full application, including his work history, and that she had a proposal that was different from the janitorial position he'd applied for, and she'd like him to hear it before deciding anything. He said he was listening. The Riverside District project had been on Vale Forge's books for 2 years. A community power system for a cluster of low-income residential buildings along the southern waterfront. Solar integration, battery backup, grid independence for 412 units. The kind of project that looked exceptional in a press release and was genuinely complicated to execute because the buildings were old and the existing electrical infrastructure didn't behave the way new construction did. The engineering team was good. What they lacked was someone who understood old buildings from the inside, not from blueprints, but from the experience of actually working in them. Someone who'd crawled through crawl spaces and structures that hadn't been updated since the 1980s. Who understood why a building's actual wiring rarely matched its official documentation. Who could look at a junction box and know what it had been through before the current owner bought the property. Marin offered Jonas a 30-day temporary position as on-site field coordinator for the Riverside project. Not a symbolic role, a functional one with a specific scope. Verify that the installation plan matched the physical reality of the buildings, flag any discrepancies to the engineering team, and helped manage the supply inventory for the installation crews. She watched him listen to this the way she'd watched him listen to everything else, carefully without interrupting. When she finished, he didn't say yes or thank you. He looked at the table between them and said he needed to be straight with her about something. He said he understood this was a better opportunity than what he'd applied for. He also said he knew how it would look. A man with no degree and no formal project management background, appearing in a high-profile role on a sensitive project connected to the CEO by a favor from 8 years ago. He said that wasn't a story he wanted attached to him or to her. And if she was offering this because she felt she owed him something, he'd rather have the janitorial position and be done with it. Maren told him she wasn't offering it because of the notebook. She was offering it because the notebook had been full of her technical work. And she'd recognized in him that morning at her door, the same thing she was recognizing now, someone who did the correct thing, not because it was convenient, but because it didn't occur to him to do otherwise. She said that quality was hard to find in people at any level of any organization, and she needed it on this particular project more than she needed another credential. He was quiet for a moment. Then he asked 3 things. First, the story of how they knew each other would not be used in any company communication or press material. Second, his compensation would reflect the actual scope of the role, not inflated as a gesture, not reduced to make it seem more modest. Third, if after 30 days it was clear he wasn't adding real value, he would leave without argument and without expectation of anything further. Maren agreed to all 3 without negotiating. Jonas looked at her for a long moment. The same steadiness she'd seen at her door at 4 in the morning, only now in daylight in a room with a view of the whole city. He said he'd take the position. Maren reached across the desk and they shook hands. His grip was firm without making anything of it. After he left, Lydia appeared in the doorway and asked if she should notify HR. Maren said yes. She also said to pull every floor plan and infrastructure document they had on the Riverside buildings because she suspected the ones they were working from were incomplete. Lydia asked how she knew that. Maren looked at the door Jonas had just walked through. Because the good ones always find what everyone else missed, she said. That's the whole point. The Riverside district didn't look like a project on the verge of something historic. It looked like what it was. 4 aging residential towers arranged around a cracked concrete courtyard. Laundry lines strung between windows, a playground with a chain-link fence, and 2 functioning swings out of 5. The buildings had been constructed in the late 1960s and had been patched, rewired, repatched, and partially rewired again across 6 different decades by contractors who each inherited the mistakes of the ones before them. Jonas showed up on his first morning with a clipboard, a flashlight, and a canvas bag of basic tools. He signed in at the site office, introduced himself to the 2 crew leads by name, and asked if anyone had a copy of the original electrical schematics from the city permit office, not the Vale Forge installation plans, the originals. The crew lead, a stocky man named Derek, said they were working off the current architectural drawings. Jonas said he understood that. He asked again about the originals. Derek told him those documents were decades old and probably not digitized. Brennan stood in the basement for another few seconds, then walked back toward the stairwell without saying anything further. The thing Jonas found in the 3rd week was not a discrepancy. It was a substitution. He'd been tracking a shipment of battery interface modules, the components that connected the building's existing panel infrastructure to the new Vale Forge storage system. The spec sheet called for a specific thermal tolerance rating because the basement of Tower 1 ran warmer than the others due to its proximity to the building's boiler system. The modules that had been installed didn't match the spec. The part numbers were close. Close enough to pass a visual check. Close enough that someone reviewing a delivery manifest wouldn't necessarily catch it. But the thermal tolerance was rated 15% lower than required. Jonas pulled 3 of them and photographed the part numbers against the spec sheet. He checked the delivery records. The substitution had happened at the supplier level before the components ever reached the site. The invoice reflected the correct part numbers, which meant either the supplier had made a documentation error or someone had deliberately billed for components they didn't deliver. He brought it to Griffin first. Griffin said the thermal difference was marginal and the system wasn't designed to run at sustained maximum load anyway. Jonas asked what happened if there was a power event that caused the system to compensate. Griffin said the safety margins in the design accounted for variance. Jonas asked if Griffin had run the thermal model with the lower-rated components substituted in. Griffin said he'd take it under consideration. His tone made clear that he wouldn't. Jonas went back to his desk and wrote the full report himself. Part numbers, thermal ratings, delivery records, photographs, the specific scenario under which the lower-rated components would exceed their operating threshold. He submitted it to the project server and sent a copy directly to Marin. Marin called him that evening. He was at the kitchen table helping Tessa with a worksheet on fractions when his phone rang. He told Tessa he'd be 5 minutes and stepped into the hallway. Marin said she'd read the report. She asked him to walk her through it. He did without editorializing. Component by component, the math, the thermal scenario, what happened to battery interface modules when they exceeded their operating temperature under load. He told her the system would probably work fine on the day of the launch. He told her it probably wouldn't work fine 6 weeks later when summer hit and the boiler system in Tower 1 was running alongside the new power storage at peak draw. Marin was quiet for a moment. Then she asked him what he thought she should do. Jonas said that wasn't his decision to make. He said he'd told her what he found and documented it as completely as he could. What happened with the information was above his level. She said she appreciated that, but she was asking anyway. He said she should delay the launch and have the components inspected by an independent engineer. He said she should also look carefully at how the substitution happened because it didn't look accidental to him. After the call ended, he went back to the kitchen. Tessa had finished the fractions worksheet and moved on to drawing something on the back of it. She looked up and asked if everything was okay. Jonas said yes and sat back down next to her. Everything was not okay. By the following morning, a summary of Jonas's component report had appeared in a message thread among project stakeholders that Jonas had not been included on. The framing was different from the report itself. Where Jonas had written a technical analysis, the summary described concerns raised by the field coordinator, a phrasing that reduced the report to a matter of one person's opinion rather than documented evidence. Brennan had responded to the thread, noting that Jonas's role was logistical coordination, not engineering assessment, and that the concerns had already been reviewed by the lead engineer and found to be within acceptable parameters. By afternoon, one of the site supervisors told Jonas that a story was going around that he'd been inserted into the project by the CEO without a competitive hiring process, that his report was being read as an attempt to justify his position by manufacturing problems, and that the board had been made aware of the situation. 3 days later, a message from HR informed Jonas that his access to the project server had been temporarily restricted pending a review of documentation submitted outside standard protocols. He read the message at his desk in the site trailer. Outside the window, he could see the courtyard of Tower 3 where 2 older women were sitting on a bench in the afternoon sun. One of them had a portable oxygen concentrator at her feet. The plastic tubing looped over her ears. That evening, Jonas told himself he should probably let this go. He documented everything. He'd reported through proper channels. He'd gone directly to Marin when the channels failed. He'd done what could reasonably be expected of someone in his position, and the machinery of the organization was now moving against him in a way that was larger than any individual could reverse. He thought about Tessa, about her school schedule, the rent, the month of financial stability this job had given them. He thought about what it would mean to walk away now versus what it would mean if he was pushed out publicly with a narrative already written. Then Brennan found him. It was after the site crew had gone for the day. Brennan came alone, without his tablet, without the careful posture of their first meeting. He sat down across from Jonas in the empty site trailer and said he wasn't there officially. He said he didn't think Jonas was wrong. He said that plainly without softening it. But then he said something else: that Vale Forge had spent 2 years and a significant portion of its next funding round building toward this launch. That 3 institutional investors had conditioned their continued participation on an on-schedule completion, and that if the project failed publicly, it wasn't just the company that would absorb the cost. It was the 412 units that would go back to the old system, possibly for years while the legal and financial fallout was sorted. He said he understood that wasn't Jonas's problem to carry. He said he was telling him anyway because he wanted Jonas to understand that the pressure wasn't personal. Jonas listened to all of it. Then he said he understood the stakes Brennan was describing. He also said that a system built on components that would fail under summer load wasn't a working system. It was a liability with a ribbon on it. And the people who would pay for that weren't the ones sitting in this conversation. Brennan didn't respond to that. He stood up, picked up his jacket from the back of the chair, and left. Jonas drove to the Riverside district that night, and sat in the parking lot for a while. He wasn't sure why. He'd told himself he was checking whether the delivery crew had left the gate unlocked, which was a real concern, and also not why he was there. He was there because he needed to look at the buildings. He got out of the car and walked to the courtyard. The lights in the stairwells of Tower 1 were on the old fluorescent kind that buzzed slightly. A window on the 6th floor was open, and he could hear a television and a child's voice asking something in the particular tone children used when they were supposed to be asleep. On the ground floor of Tower 2, through a window he happened to pass, he saw a woman who couldn't have been more than 30, sitting with a baby on her lap in front of a box fan, the kind with a broken tilt mechanism that pointed it permanently at the ceiling. The baby was coughing, the slow, rhythmic cough that Jonas associated with respiratory problems. The woman was rocking forward and back, not going anywhere. Just moving because movement was something to do when there was nothing else available. Jonas stood there for a moment. Then he walked back to his car, sat in the driver's seat, and made a decision that he understood would cost him something. He wasn't sure yet what exactly, but he understood the structure of the choice. Clearly, there was a version of this where he protected himself and a version where he didn't. And the components in that basement would eventually fail either way, and the only question was whether anyone with knowledge of the failure had chosen to say so while it still mattered. He drove home. He helped Tessa with her reading. He put her to bed and sat at the kitchen table for another hour, finishing the documentation he'd started before his server access was restricted. Working from the copies he'd saved locally. Then the rain came. It started around midnight, 3 days before the final inspection. The kind of rain that the Weather Service had flagged as moderate, but that the Riverside District's drainage system patched and partially relined in 2011 and not significantly since, experienced as something closer to severe. By 2 o'clock in the morning, water was moving through the basement of Tower 3 in a way that the sump system was not managing adequately. The partial short happened at 2:47. Not catastrophic, the building's existing breaker system caught it before it spread, but one of the auxiliary distribution panels went offline, which meant the backup lighting for floors 2 through 4 went dark. And more relevantly, the portable medical equipment on the 3rd floor lost power for 11 minutes before the building's generator kicked in. Jonas heard about it at 6 o'clock in the morning from Patricia Hale, who managed community operations for the Riverside buildings and had had his number since the 2nd week when he'd helped her track down a missing equipment delivery. Patricia said the residents were shaken. The building manager was fielding complaints and the site crew was pointing at Jonas's access to the auxiliary panels as a possible contributing factor. By 8, Brennan had sent a formal request to Marin asking that Jonas be removed from the project pending investigation. That same night, Brennan sat alone in his office long after the building had emptied. He pulled up the forwarded copy of Jonas's original component report, the one he'd received 3 weeks ago, and filed without escalating. He read it through completely for the first time. Not the summary, the full report. The part numbers, the thermal ratings, the scenario Jonas had described in plain language. Summer load, boiler proximity, sustained draw. He sat with it for a long time. The certainty he'd carried into every conversation about this project. That the engineering team's sign-off was sufficient. That the timeline pressure justified the risk. Had developed a crack he couldn't close. He didn't call anyone. He didn't send a message. He just sat there reading a document he should have read weeks ago, understanding what it meant. Maren called Jonas at 8:17. She told him what the request said. She told him she hadn't responded yet. She asked him directly if he had touched the auxiliary panel in Tower 3. He said yes once 2 weeks ago to photograph the grounding connections which he had documented in the report that had since been removed from the active project folder. Maren said she knew. She said she was calling because she wanted him to hear directly from her that she was not going to respond to Brennan's request for 24 hours and that she needed him to be honest with her about one thing. She asked if he was certain about the components. Jonas said he was certain. She said okay. Then she said she was sorry this had happened. He told her not to be. He said she'd given him a fair shot and he'd done the work. Whatever came next was what came next. After the call ended, he sat in his car outside the site trailer in the rain. He thought about Tessa waking up in a few hours, getting herself dressed because she knew how to now, pouring her cereal, waiting by the door with her backpack because she didn't want to make him late. Then he drove home to take his daughter to school. That evening, Tessa found him sitting at the kitchen table with his hands flat on the surface, not doing anything. She climbed into the chair across from him, the way she did when she had decided something needed to be said. She asked if he'd told the truth about the buildings. He said yes. She thought about this with the particular seriousness that 8-year-olds brought to questions they'd been turning over for a while. Then she said that if he'd told the truth, he hadn't lost yet. Jonas looked at his daughter across the kitchen table. He thought about the oxygen concentrator on the courtyard bench. He thought about a document saved on his local drive that nobody had deleted because they hadn't known to look for it. He opened his laptop and got back to work. The boardroom on the 12th floor had floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the city's eastern waterfront. On a clear morning, you could see the Riverside district from there, the 4 towers, the courtyard, the river beyond them catching the light. Maren had chosen the room deliberately. She wanted the board to be able to see what they were deciding about. 7 people sat around the table. Brennan was already there when she arrived. His materials organized in front of him, with the neat precision of someone who had spent the previous night preparing, and also she noticed, with the slightly diminished certainty of someone who had spent part of that night reading something he wished he'd read sooner. He looked up when Maren walked in and gave her a brief nod. Not hostile, careful, she nodded back and took her seat at the head of the table. Brennan presented first, which she had agreed to because she wanted the full shape of the argument visible before she responded. He walked through the timeline cleanly. The non-standard hiring of Jonas Reed, the sequence of reports submitted outside established protocols, the disruption to the engineering team's workflow, the incident in Tower 3's basement, and the formal request from the lead contractor to remove Jonas from the project. He framed it without hyperbole. He said he understood Maren had reasons for the hire that she believed were sound. He said the board's responsibility was to evaluate outcomes rather than intentions. He said Vale Forge had spent 2 years and considerable capital building the Riverside project into a flagship demonstration of what the company could deliver. He said 1 month from a fully operational system was not the moment to absorb the reputational cost of a public dispute over a non-standard hire who had created friction at every level of the project team. He said all of this calmly with the measured delivery of a man who had rehearsed it and also believed less of it than he had the day before. When he finished, one of the board members, a woman named Sandra, who had been with Vale Forge since the second funding round, asked Maren if she'd like to respond. Marin said she would, but first, she wanted to share something that had arrived in her email at 6:43 that morning. She opened her laptop and turned it toward the table. At the same time the board meeting began, Jonas was standing in the basement of Tower 3. Patricia Hale had called him at 5:30 before the sun was fully up. Her voice carrying the particular flatness of someone who had been managing a crisis through the night and was running on the other side of exhaustion. She said the building's electrical contractor had looked at the auxiliary panel and couldn't fully explain why the backup system had taken 11 minutes to restore, and that 2 residents had already filed formal complaints with the city housing office, and that the inspection scheduled for the following day was in serious jeopardy. Jonas said he'd be there in 30 minutes. He dropped Tessa at school first. He walked her to the front entrance the way he always did, waited until she was inside. Then drove to the Riverside district and signed himself in at the site gate using his original contractor badge, which no one had formally deactivated because the removal request was still listed as pending in the HR system. The basement of Tower 3 smelled like wet concrete and something electrical not burning, just the particular metallic sharpness that came from a system that had been pushed. Jonas set his bag down next to the auxiliary panel and opened it. Patricia stood behind him with a flashlight. He spent the next 90 minutes going through the panel section by section. What he found confirmed what he had suspected since the rain. The short had not originated in the panel itself. It had originated in a connection point between the new Vale Forge battery distribution line and the building's existing infrastructure, specifically at one of the junction points where a lower-rated interface module had been installed. The rain had raised the ambient temperature in the basement by enough to push the module past its operating threshold. The module hadn't failed completely, but it had throttled, and the resulting voltage irregularity had tripped the auxiliary breaker in a sequence the system hadn't been designed to handle. The panel hadn't malfunctioned, the component had. Jonas photographed everything. He documented the temperature readings from the module's built-in sensor log, which had recorded the thermal event in a data format that could be exported and read by any standard electrical analysis tool. He pulled the module, bagged it, labeled it, and set it in his canvas bag next to the original spec sheet he'd brought from home. Then he sat on the basement floor with his back against the wall and typed the full technical summary on his phone, attaching the photographs and the sensor log export, and sent it to Marin's direct email address at 6:43 in the morning. He didn't know she was walking into a board meeting in 47 minutes. He sent it because it was ready and because every hour it sat unsent was an hour the information wasn't where it needed to be. Then he stood up, picked up his bag, and went upstairs to talk to the residents. The board looked at the screen. The summary was 4 pages. Marin didn't walk them through all of it. She walked them through 3 things. The module's part number against the specification. The sensor log showing the thermal event and the delivery invoice showing that the higher-rated components had been built and paid for by Vale Forge while lower-rated components had been installed. Sandra asked who had authorized the substitution. Marin said that was what an independent audit would determine. Another board member, a man named Howard, who had been quiet through Brennan's presentation, asked how long the discrepancy had been documented internally. Marin said Jonas Reed had submitted his initial report through the project server 3 weeks ago. She said the report had been reclassified and his server access had been restricted before the full documentation could be reviewed by anyone at the executive level. Howard asked who had authorized the restriction. Marin didn't answer immediately. She looked at Brennan. Brennan was looking at the laptop screen at the sensor log export, specifically the column of temperature readings, climbing steadily through the minutes before the event. He had the expression of a man who had already done this arithmetic alone in his office the night before and was now watching it confirmed in front of 7 people. He said without looking up. The audit should be independent. The contractor's documentation needs to go to an outside firm. Sanders said that was what Marin had just proposed. Brennan said he knew. He said he was agreeing with it. Then he looked up at the board and said that his concern throughout this process had been timeline and funding stability, and that he had weighted those factors in a way that had led him to discount technical flags that warranted closer attention. He said he was not in a position to determine whether the component substitution was the contractor's error or something deliberate. But that question needed an answer before any system in those buildings went live. He said it without apology or theater, and then he stopped talking. Howard nodded once and wrote something down. Maren looked at Brennan for a moment, then turned back to the board. She said she was proposing 3 things. An independent engineering audit of all installed components across the 4 towers, a formal suspension of the contractor pending the audit's findings, and a revised launch timeline to be determined once the audit was complete. Sandra asked what she intended to do about Jonas Reed. Maren said she intended to offer him a permanent position as field safety lead for Vale Forge's residential projects division with final sign-off authority on component verification for any installation in occupied residential buildings. Howard asked if she was concerned about the optics of that decision given the circumstances. Maren said she was more concerned about what happened the next time a lower-rated component got installed in a building where someone was keeping themselves alive with electrical medical equipment. No one said anything to that. The vote to proceed with the audit passed 6-1. The dissenting vote was Howard's, not because he opposed the audit, but because he wanted the scope expanded to include the project server records from the past 6 weeks. Maren said she'd make sure of it. The audit took 11 days. The independent firm found 17 component substitutions across the 4 towers, all following the same pattern. Correct part numbers on the invoices, lower specification parts installed. The substitutions had been systematic enough to suggest deliberate procurement fraud rather than supplier error. The contractor's project manager was suspended pending a legal review. 2 employees of the supplier were placed on administrative leave while the invoicing records were examined. Griffin, the lead engineer, who had twice dismissed Jonas's reports without conducting a physical inspection, was placed on a formal performance review. The audit noted that his sign-offs had been cited as justification for overriding Jonas's documented concerns and that this had contributed directly to the delay in identifying the component issue. He was not terminated, but his sign-off authority on residential projects was suspended pending retraining on third-party component verification protocols. Brennan cooperated fully with the internal portion of the review. The investigation noted that he had received Jonas's original component report through a forwarded message and had not escalated it, a significant lapse in oversight protocol. It also noted that he had been the first executive to call for an independent audit once the sensor log was presented and that his cooperation with the review had been complete and unobstructed. The board voted to retain him in a modified role with restructured oversight responsibilities. He and Maren did not discuss it directly until 3 weeks after the audit concluded, when they happened to be the last 2 people in the building after a late project meeting. They rode the elevator down together in silence for several floors. Then Brennan said he'd read Jonas's first report when it came through and told himself the thermal variance was within a range the design could absorb. He said he had known when he read it that it deserved a physical inspection. He said he had chosen not to push for one because the timeline was already under pressure and he'd believed or had wanted to believe that Griffin's sign-off was sufficient. Maren said she understood. Brennan said he wasn't sure it was the kind of thing that could be fully understood from the outside. He said he had spent 20 years protecting organizations from the costs of being wrong. And somewhere in that process, he'd started treating the protection itself as the goal rather than the means. Maren said she'd built a company on a foundation she hadn't fully acknowledged for 8 years because she hadn't wanted to need the acknowledgement. She said she understood more than he thought about choosing convenient certainty over difficult truth. Brennan looked at her. Then the elevator reached the lobby and they went their separate ways. The system came online on a Tuesday afternoon in early October, nearly 3 months after the original launch date. There was no stage, no press riser, no branded backdrop, no catered reception in the courtyard. Dale Forge's communications team had offered all of those things and Marin had declined them. She said the people who lived in the buildings didn't need to watch a company celebrate doing something it should have done correctly the first time. What happened instead was that the switch was flipped by Patricia Hale in the basement of Tower 1 with a small group of residents and technicians and one journalist from a local housing advocacy publication watching. Patricia did it without ceremony. The lights in the stairwell stabilized. The elevator in Tower 3, which had been running on a voltage supply that had been inconsistent for years, began moving with a smoothness that several residents later said they had never experienced in the building. On the third floor, the woman who had relied on a portable oxygen concentrator since her husband had brought it home from the medical supply store 14 months ago went through a full night without once checking whether the power was still on. Marin found out about that last detail from Patricia, who texted her 3 days after the launch with no context, just the information plainly stated. She read it twice, then put her phone face down on her desk and sat quietly for a while. Jonas was in the basement of Tower 1 when Marin arrived that afternoon. He was working through the final item on the post-launch verification checklist with a technician named Ray, who had been part of the original installation crew and who had over the course of the audit and reinstallation become one of the more reliable members of the field team. They were documenting the thermal readings on the replacement modules, the correct ones, installed 2 weeks prior, and Ray was noting them on a tablet while Jonas read them off the sensor display. Marin stood in the doorway until they finished the sequence. Then regathered his materials and headed for the stairwell, nodding to her on his way past. Jonas set down the sensor probe and looked at her. She said the numbers looked good. He said they did. He said the Tower 1 basement was running 2 degrees cooler than projected, which he attributed to the ventilation adjustment the facilities team had made to the boiler room exhaust. He said it would be worth monitoring through the winter to see if the differential held. Marin said she'd make sure it was on the schedule. They stood in the basement for a moment, the sound of the building systems running quietly around them, the low hum of the battery storage array, the ventilation moving air through the ducts, the muffled sound of an elevator cable somewhere above them doing what it was supposed to do. Marin said she owed him something. She hadn't said directly. Jonas said she didn't owe him anything. She said she knew he believed that. She said she was going to say it anyway. She said that 8 years ago he had given her back something that made everything she'd built possible and that she had spent a long time telling herself the debt was between her and the universe rather than between her and a specific person because it was more comfortable that way. She said what he'd done on this project wasn't the same kind of thing. It wasn't a favor. It was work and it was the right call. And she would have been wrong to frame it as anything else. But she said the same quality in him had made both things happen. The walk across the city in the middle of the night and the report he sent at 6:43 in the morning, knowing it might end his position. She said she thought he should know that she saw it clearly and that she wasn't going to pretend otherwise. Jonas looked at the floor for a moment. Then he said he appreciated that. He said he'd spent the last several years trying to make sure Tessa understood that doing the right thing wasn't the same as doing the easy thing and that he'd spent a lot of that time hoping he was giving her an example worth following rather than just a principle worth saying. He said this project had been the first time in a long time that he felt certain he'd actually demonstrated it rather than just described it. Marin nodded. From the stairwell above them came the sound of footsteps. Small quick ones that didn't match the measured pace of any of the technicians. Then Tessa appeared in the basement doorway, backpack still on, holding a strip of adhesive labels she'd apparently gotten from somewhere in the site office upstairs. She was 9 now, had been for 6 weeks, and she had the same quality of stillness her father carried, except in her it coexisted with the directness that occasionally startled adults. She looked at the basement around her with the assessing attention Jonas recognized as entirely her own, then held up the labels and asked if she could mark the ones that had been checked. Ray, who had apparently escorted her down, appeared behind her in the doorway with the expression of a man who had been unable to say no to a 9-year-old with a specific plan. Jonas told her she could mark the ones on the lower row, which he showed her, and she set to work with the focused efficiency of someone who had been waiting for a task that matched her capabilities. Maren watched her for a moment. Then she looked at Jonas. He was watching his daughter press a label onto a component housing, check that it was straight and move to the next one. His expression was the same one Maren had first seen across her desk. Steady without performance, but with something underneath it, now that she recognized as the particular satisfaction of a person who had been tested by something real and had not looked away. The building hummed around them, carrying 412 households through an ordinary Tuesday evening.